Lord, we are asking you for help. We're asking, Lord, to give us understanding. We're asking, Lord, that you'd equip us so that we can deal with church history. Reveal yourself to us, Lord, even through the church history. Cause us to understand, cause us to be interested, cause us to want to know. Lord, we are asking you for help. We ask you, Lord, to give us understanding. Amen. We're asking, Lord, to... Okay. So, Sister Annie, over to you, please.
Thank you, Brother Freddie. Are you hearing me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you, Brother Freddie, and good afternoon, everyone.
Video,
I just
please.
like to
Video, please.
wish.
Video, please. Video, please.
You want the video too? All right. Let me see. Okay. That all right?
Yes, Sister Annie.
Good. All right. Good afternoon again, and I would just like to wish everybody God's blessing throughout this new year. No, the last time we were in church, history last month, beginning of last month, we were still in North America, USA. I want to leave North America, right? And come back to Britain. That's what I wanted to do a long time, but so much was going on, right? But I want to get back into Britain. So that is where I would be starting this afternoon. And I just call it revival in Britain in the 19th century. So at the start of the 19th century, when godly people in the USA were crying out to God for revival and were beginning to get answers in the Second Great Awakening, there were similar feelings and desires in Britain. Right? So there is a connection between the two. While all that was happening in USA, back in Britain, people are experiencing some of the same desires and not identical occurrences, but encountering God in answer to God to prayers. However, this is my explanation. Because so much time has been spent on the events in America, it seems necessary to me, as we return to Britain, to briefly reconnect with what was happening there at the turn of the 18th century into the early 19th century. I am doing this so that it would not appear to be confused, right? So I am just going to briefly recap certain things that you would have heard some months ago, but so that nobody would feel, well, where are we now? Not too sure where you're going from here. I am back in Britain, but I am picking up the threads at the turn of the 18th into the 19th century. Now, Britain had experienced a spiritual revival in the second half of the 18th century, which gave rise to the start of the Methodist Church. Now, the Methodist Church formally separated from the Church of England in 1795, 4 years after John Wesley's death. The new church was full of zeal and continued to grow quickly, spreading across England, into Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, so throughout Britain. Church continued to do well in the new century, but inevitably, organization took some of its energy. The original church, known as the Wesleyan Methodist Church, as successful as it was, began to seek to remain respectable and some of its radical crusading zeal began to be dissipated. Some members seeking to retain the some members seeking to retain the original vitality created breakaway factions. Okay? Created breakaway factions. Namely, before the end of the century, the Methodist New Connection in 1797. And then over in the new century, in 1811, we had the primitive Methodists breaking away from the main body. And in 1815, you had another group called the Methodist New Connect, the Bible Christians. These, we may assume, represented people's desire for more of God, because as people settle down and they begin to lose some of their steam, some people who were around before and remember what it was like wanted to keep that zeal. So for various reasons, that and maybe some other reasons too, we had breakaway factions. But the church, everybody, all the factions were calling themselves by the name Methodist. You also had other evangelicals within Britain continuing to be active. For example, the Baptists, especially the specific, those referred to as specific Baptists, which is really those who were Calvinist or Calvinist in their outlook. You had the holiness movement, which had begun in the time of Wesley. You also continue to have Quakers, though the Quakers are reported to have been declining in numbers by then. So it's not that in Britain they lacked evangelicalism there, but the new century had new challenges. The early 19th century, in the early 19th century, right? I call this new challenges in the early 19th century, which were political, social, and economic. So there was national insecurity in Britain. You don't usually hear much about this when we're doing church history, but these are things that make people uncomfortable and, full of fear. There was the fear that the upheaval that had just taken place in France would still happen in Britain. There was a threat. And in 1799, a dictator had taken hold of France, began to make war across Europe, and intended to bring Britain down, right? Looking for the glorious return of the supremacy of France. Right? Britain was at war in the early 19th century, and this would have brought fear and insecurity to people. But thank God, Britain was not conquered. And by 1814, Napoleon was brought under control and fighting ended. Other issue that had started since the century before was the growing industrial revolution in England. It also brought social and economic distress to some people, wealth to others. Big factories created booming cities where the poor fell into the slums with their deprivation, depravity, and hopelessness. So the lower class in the early 19th century were suffering more and more because they were not sharing in the wealth of the Industrial Revolution. They were not the factory owners and the bankers. Right? They were the people who were being paid starvation wages. Right? Those were problems on a national level. Now, there were also problems with evangelicalism within the state church. So although we have by then societies across Britain where there are a number of evangelicals doing their work honestly and conscientiously, yet there were problems. There were evangelicals within the state church. From John Wesley's days, there was a significant evangelical faction that remained within the Church of England. As with evangelicals outside the Anglican Church, those within saw a lessening of their zeal by the 1820s. The second generation did not have the energy and vision of the founders. This is something that we see happening all the time. Evangelicals received increasing popular support and social acceptance within the Church of England. They became comfortable as their more radical brethren left the established church. That lessened the tensions within the church, and the crusading fervor quieted down once more into a genteel piety. As they got more support, the offensive, quote unquote, enthusiasm that the church so despised in the previous century, that eased off. It waned and persecution died down. So by 1820, they were accepted, and many fashionable people now became evangelicals. So as different from Wesley's day, where they were despised because of this so-called enthusiasm, right? And supernatural occurrences and emotionalism and things like that, for which they were despised in the Anglican Church. That tended to die down. It waned, right? The more radical ones went out and formed Methodists and formed other groups. But those who remained started to become polished again so as to be socially acceptable. And so the persecution stopped. So it wasn't a group of evangelicals now on their toes, but a more comfortable, complacent kind of respectable evangelicalism within the church. And it was okay now to be an evangelical, and some very fashionable and prominent people were evangelicals within the Anglican Church. Much of their energies, and we're still dealing with those who remained, that faction that remained within the Church of England. Much of their energies were now taken up by social welfare and missionary endeavors. Now, this is inevitable when organizations grow. They got to be managed. They got to be administered, right? This is not something wrong, but then we find that it takes up the energies. So it's not quite the same as it used to be. They were sincere evangelical believers, but the zeal for basic evangelism among the masses is what had waned. And at a time when it was even more needed for the booming populations of the big cities. For example, the Clapham Street group, that was an evangelical Anglican group. It flourished in the early 19th century with wealthy evangelicals like John Venn, whose son would later feature in the early records of the Plymouth Brethren movement. We have Zachary Macaulay, Henry Thornton, and William Wilberforce. Now, these people got very active in social issues, and we know for a fact that they were successful in bringing about the abolition of the slave trade and eventually slavery in British possessions. So it's not that they were just idle, but it's just that other things seemed so important that there wasn't much of these large meetings where individuals would be coming to the Lord in droves, as what was happening before. But at this stage, it was still very much needed, right? Even more so than the century before. So those people who grew up, the new generation, who grew up in respectable evangelical families, it became evangelicalism, big word, you have to keep calling it. To be an evangelical Christian, to know the gospel and that Christ died for your sins, and to, the whole gospel, it became commonplace. They saw no need for them to, there wasn't any need as far as they could see for them to quote unquote discover their faith like those before them. They were not even sure that it was necessary for them to have a conversion experience. But they seem to have grown up always knowing the gospel, right? And this is something that we have to deal with all the time. We are in scripture admonished to bring up children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and we do that. But then there is this issue that some people feel that, and some I tell you that they've always known the Lord, and but there isn't that same zeal. And many people, many of those youngsters who come up knowing the gospel, many of them don't see it necessary to have a conversion experience. They can't point to any conversion experience, but they know everything, right? So there is a bit of a confusion there. In the generation before, their elders, their parents and their grandparents would have insisted that people must have a personal encounter. But by the time we get to the 1820s, there is this laxity about it. And some people are not even sure. But for those who did have a conversion experience, and others who were hungry for God, many became disillusioned with the established church. Many sought new fellowships. Others listened to new voices, whether sound or unsound. So people again were searching. People were searching again for something new, something more from God. Now, there was a man that rose up by the name of Edward Irving. So I am looking briefly at Edward Irving and the founding of what became known as the Catholic Apostolic Church. Now, Edward Irving, was he? Irving was a Scottish Presbyterian minister whose followers became known as Irvingites. With orator, and became one of London's most famous preachers in the 19th century. Many influential people flocked to hear his sermons on his favorite topic, the last days. This was a subject about which he became passionate, almost obsessed. And here we see a similarity to what was going on in the movements in USA. There was at this time, almost in every movement in either part of the Atlantic, over in America, in Britain, there is this interest in the fact that these are the last days and that Christ would be coming back within another few years. And, there is need for you to do much, right? But look out for the bodily return of Christ. Everybody was excited about that. So that was one of his areas of concentration. And a lot of people, influential people, highly educated people, flocked to hear his sermons once he got to London, right? Many of his followers were said to have received revelations, to have seen visions, and to have spoken in tongues. So there was that aspect of his work, his meetings. Some authorities regard him as a forerunner of the charismatic movement. Others are skeptical of him because of some of his ideas that seem controversial. Now, go a little more into who Irving was and what were his ideas. Irving was born in the town of Annan in Scotland on the 4th of August, 1792. He was of ordinary origin, but received a sound education, graduating in 1809 from the University of Edinburgh. For a short time, he was a teacher heading a new academy. He studied divinity as well and was licensed to preach from June 1815. So he was a Presbyterian preacher. He also continued to study academics. He was into studying mathematics and the physical sciences. In addition, he began to read old classics, a lover of certain kinds of classics, including his favorite author, theologian Richard Hooker. He was fond of Arabian Nights and also carried in his pocket a miniature copy of James Macpherson's cycle of poems, a book known as Ossian. In 1818, he resigned from teaching to become a minister in the Church of Scotland in St. John's Parish in Glasgow. Irving is said to have had an embracing personality and vibrant spirit. In 1821, he was invited by the Caledonian Church of Scotland in Hatton Garden, London, to minister to a small congregation. And the following year, 1822, he was ordained their church minister. So that is how he got to London. In London, he rose to prominence as important members of English society flocked to hear him, including George Canning, Member of Parliament of the House of Commons. Canning was somebody also involved in fighting against the slave trade and slavery. He made a great impression on the political, legal, and scientific men of the 1820s, but he soon began to be regarded by many as controversial. And I have tried to list a few, well, as many of Irving's ideas, so that we can look at them, listen to them, and get to understand what he was after and what kind of ministry really had. He believed that the church was entering an era of judgment in preparation for Christ's imminent return, which he calculated would take place in 1868. Right away, we see that he is out on the radical fringe. He based it on what he calls numerology from the book of Revelation. Very similar to what happened to William Miller in the USA. He set a date, right? And he worked out a date, and that Christ would return in 1868, right? People were very interested in that. He believed that he himself was specially prepared to teach his prophetic and apocalyptic message to the leading men of his day. He also felt that the early spirituality of the church, the New Testament church that is, had become stagnated. So more and more, he began to emphasize the supernatural in his ministry. We hear of his people seeing visions and having other supernatural experiences, speaking in tongues and all of that. Now, however, one of the things that got him into trouble was that he laid emphasis on the human nature of Christ to an extent which the church thought unacceptable. Right? So not that only that Jesus was fully human and fully God, but he tended to be listing over to the side where Jesus to him was just a man. And I have heard people preach that in my lifetime, right? That all Jesus was a spirit-filled man, showing us he left all his divinity in heaven. And when he got here, all he was a man living by the power of the Spirit of God. I don't know. I have not actually read the details of how he explained what he believed, but he laid emphasis on the humanness of Christ to an extent where the church thought that he had carried it beyond what was the truth. Another side to him, he became fascinated with the ideas of a Spanish Jesuit by the name of Manuel Lacunza. This man also gave himself a Jewish name, but a number of the ideas were somewhat Roman Catholic, right? But he and the Spanish Jesuit became friends, very friendly, and he was fascinated with this man's ideas, all about the end times and the coming of Christ and the end of the world, right? So some people were very excited about him with that, while others began to say, no, something wrong here. He also became a good friend of a famous poet in the 19th century by the name of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Okay? And he was also fond of Coleridge's work. He called Coleridge an eloquent mystic. So he knew that Coleridge was a mystic. Coleridge was the man who wrote The Ancient Mariner for people who went to school in our days. Huh? And Coleridge, it is said, it was believed, I don't know how true it is, but people were of the opinion that Coleridge used to write under the influence of substances like opium, right? He wrote several poems, but The Ancient Mariner, I think, is the most famous, right? And in Ancient Mariner, you don't get the impression that Coleridge was any Bible believer. Coleridge is definitely a Catholic because he makes reference to giving thanks to Mary, Queen of Heaven, who sent him a gentle sleep from heaven, right? Remember reading that. So, but he became very close to Coleridge. And people became suspicious of that, right? So Coleridge was already under suspicion by the church. He also he stressed the New Testament gifts of prophecy and healing, which is part of the supernatural. Now, in 1823, he published his own volume of oration and dedicated it to Coleridge. Now, this publication created a lot of debate, and controversy around Irving. Right? The leaders of the early Plymouth Brethren, by then we're getting into the 1820s and 1830s. Leaders of the early Plymouth Brethren, including John Nelson Darby, attended at least one of Irving's conferences on the subject of unfulfilled prophecy and Irving's new ideas, held at Powerscourt House, one of the residences of the upper class people. And these meetings continued, these conferences continued yearly until 1830. So even the fledgling Plymouth Brethren movement came under some amount of his influence. How much it influenced them, I can't assess that, but at least they were among the crowds listening. In 1830, the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland excommunicated him for heresy. Put him out. By this time, he had his own church building, his own congregation, and his congregation simply reordained him and retained him as their pastor. So they virtually broke away from the Church of Scotland. He had, in reality, created his own church. At its height, the denomination had some 50,000 members in numerous churches throughout England. So that was the start of the Catholic Apostolic Church. Now, his life was cut short by illness on the 7th of December, 1834, at the age of just 42. However, he had established a new denomination which devised its own beliefs and its own rights. And we get just an idea of what kind of a church it was, because after his death, they consecrated him sometime later. He was consecrated as a quote unquote angel in the Catholic Apostolic faith. So you get an idea what kind of denomination that was. There's something Roman Catholic about it, right? His life was cut off suddenly, but the denomination continued to exist, and it was heavily funded by a banking family. And it is said that the few Catholic apostolic churches that still exist in England are still funded by the descendants of that family. So we don't hear much about the Catholic, at least we don't hear much about the Catholic Apostolic Church, but he is the person that was responsible for having that established. Right? So he was a big name among the fashionable and educated people in the 19th century Britain. So that was Edward Irving. Now, I move to the origin and early development of the Plymouth Brethren. That's the church that we know. We have come to know at least one part of that movement, which we call the Christian Brethren. But in the beginning, it was one small movement known as the Plymouth Brethren movement, right? So because I wanted to pay some attention to them because I noticed that in some lists of important denominations, they're not even mentioned. And they have had significant influence throughout not only Britain itself, but British possessions around the world. Now, it was at the same time of Irving in the 1820s that the Plymouth Brethren emerged. People, both inside and outside of the established church in Ireland and England. So here we're dealing with not only England, but specifically Ireland and England when it comes to the start of the Brethren, the Plymouth Brethren movement. Right? The established church in Ireland actually is the Church of England, Ireland being a British possession at that time. So the Church of Ireland is actually the Church of England, the Anglican Church, state church in Ireland. So in Ireland and England, the state church operated, but people both inside and outside of this established church, of these established churches, were searching for a more intense experience with God and a more satisfying fellowship than they were experiencing with the world. Although the Plymouth Brethren are usually regarded as an English church, it actually began, the church actually began in Ireland. It is significant that many of its founding members had been members of the Church of England. And one notable one, more than one, but this notable one, John Nelson Darby, had been an ordained priest. Now, how did this thing really start and why? It appears that the aim of this group was to provide a fellowship with, in which all true believers could worship together and gather around the Lord's table and also study the scriptures without being divided by different denominational allegiances. Right? Now, the early leaders included the Irishman, St. John Nelson Darby, who was one of many of the ex-clergy, ex-ministers of the established church. Benjamin Wales Newton, who was an ex-Quaker. George Muller, and Anthony Norris Groves, who became known as a pioneer of Brethren missions. Now, by this time, studying Bible prophecy had become a respectable academic pursuit. Intellectual, not academic, but intellectual pursuit. So it was nothing unusual, right, or lacking in respectability for anybody to be interested in Bible prophecy. Evans had been into it. Evans was into it up until he died, and people were interested. But the Brethren group had their own version of it. Some more on that, a little more on that later. But the data for the very early beginnings of this group, data is hard to get for more than one reason. First, not a lot of record keeping was done, because in the very early stages, one of the things that they firmly believe is that it won't be long before Christ would personally return. So why are we piling up records? Just what is very necessary to get the preaching done and get people converted. That's all is necessary. So there aren't a whole lot of detailed records. For example, no specific date on which the first meeting was held, things like that. Who did what exactly when? But we have a general, already gets a general idea. And secondly, it's hard to find because wherever it does exist, some of the members, the elderly members that historians have approached are cagey. They hide the information because they don't feel that comfortable about, unbelieving historians poking and prying into the issues and the mistakes they made and what they hide it. So some records are known to exist, but they are not accessible. So some of the dates and extremely fine details are missing. But the early movement may be pieced together through the lives of some of its earliest members. And one of the oldest among them was a man named Anthony Norris Groves, right? Now, by looking at what we can find out about their lives and their connection with it, we get an idea of what was going on. So I will look just briefly at who Anthony Norris Groves was. Now, Groves was born in Newton, Hampshire on the 1st of February, 1795. He was among the oldest of the group. He was by profession trained as a dentist by the time in Plymouth. By the time he was 19 years old, he was apprenticed to uncle or something like that, but he was a professional, then he was a dentist by the time he was 19. Now, in 1816, we see him married and moving to Exeter from Plymouth. There, he became a convinced evangelical, right? Want to call it a conversion? Maybe, right? Sounds so, but they don't give us a whole lot of detail. Can't find a whole lot of detail, about that. But it sounds like some type of conversion experience. He became a convinced evangelical under the influence of a lady named Bessie Paget, one of two sisters who later became well known among the Plymouth Brethren. So she introduced him to evangelical Christianity and probably to the Lord himself. He became the type of person that wanted to give himself completely and everything he had totally to the Lord. He believed that all his possessions should be used in the service of God. And he lived on a minimum of his income, saved nothing, and gave away the rest. All who were in need, I guess. Now, he was planning to be ordained in the established church. Okay? And so, with ordination in view, he went and attended Trinity College in Ireland. So he goes over to Ireland and he attends Trinity College in Ireland, matriculated the college from Trinity College on the 16th of October, 1826. Now, in Ireland, Dublin, he met a man named John Gifford Bellet, who was already a wealthy evangelical. Now, John Bellet had strong connections with the established church because his two brothers were already priests. They already taken orders. John was educated at Exeter Grammar School and at the Trinity Dublin College himself, where he met with John Nelson Darby. Right? Now, this is where these three met. We have Groves and Gifford Bellet and John Nelson Darby all meeting up in Dublin, Ireland. Now, Darby and Bellet both studied law. Darby studied in Dublin and Bellet returned to London. In 1822, Bellet returned to Dublin, and Groves and Bellet spent much time together. Groves shared his views with Bellet, views that later became part of the Plymouth Brethren outlook. Like 1827, a continued friendship. Groves began to suggest to Bellet that Christians should be free to, quote unquote, break bread. They began to use the term break bread. I don't think that is used within the Anglican Church. Christians should be free to break bread together without the presence of any ordained minister, right? And that it should be done weekly, right? Not once a month, but weekly. At the time, Groves was still in training to be a priest. So it doesn't appear that that was put into practice immediately. It was a suggestion, an idea, right? Which later would become part of their system, right? But it doesn't appear that having shared that idea in 1827, that they immediately put it into practice. But Groves discontinued his ministerial training with the established church and sought to go as an independent missionary to the East. Because he lost faith in the establishment, and he felt that it wasn't a requirement in the Bible that you should have some high academic qualification in order to preach. He just discontinued his training, felt it was a waste of time. And he decided that he would go as an independent missionary to the East. He now believed the Bible never required ministerial training for a man in order to qualify him to preach. Christians could meet for worship without the presence of any ordained priest, trusting that God would guide some member of the group to speak. Now, this, we remember, was a Quaker idea since the 1600s. They don't plan anything. they come together and trust that God will give somebody a supernatural utterance. It's a Quaker idea, but Bella apparently knew nothing much about the Quakers because, according to his own testimony, the idea had a profound impact on him. So it's not something that, he heard of before, he's accustomed to hearing. By this time, Groves also had the desire to establish a broad communion fellowship based solely on personal faith. So in December 1828, he wrote that he no longer, quote, communicates solely in the Church of England, but was ready to break bread with all true believers. But the following year, spring, Groves left as a missionary, independent missionary for the East, and to Baghdad as a missionary, right? And this departure was even before the first Brethren meeting. Now, two others, Edward Cronin and Edward Wilson, were two people who had belonged to established churches, but who found themselves out of fellowship and isolated, right? Out of the established church, isolated. And they met as friends and began to break bread together, right? And that continued, that private coming together to break bread without any priest or anybody presiding over it to share it, right? That continued for a period of at least 3 years, somewhere between 1826 and 1829. Now, we're going into all this to see if we can discover how this group actually got started and when they started. But just to give at least a close idea, a pretty close idea. We don't have the exact date, at least sometime close to it. It was in November 1829. November 1829 apparently is the first definite date that can be found of the Brethren meeting in Dublin. So though we haven't got a date and any big declaration or anything declared open, right? We have it is narrowed down to somewhere in November 1829. That at least is the first date time that is available, that the group definitely was meeting, right, in Dublin. So here is where the Brethren movement had its birth, somewhere in November 1829. Now, at that time, all the men, or most of them, had their own denominational connections, their own affiliation. They were still members of whatever the established Church of England in Dublin. And others who came in from whatever group they came, they hadn't severed connections. So this was a group that started to meet as a supplement to wherever they were, whatever they were getting, where they were attached to, they would come and meet with this group, but they hadn't left their previous churches. They weren't satisfied, they wanted something more. So this group was not a church at the time, but it was a small group of people exercising a belief that they had a right as believers, without the presence of any priest, to meet, break bread, sing, pray, and listen to some exhortation which they trust that the Holy Spirit would give one of them, right? Now, it is apparent that a few small groups of evangelicals in Dublin had been meeting to break bread privately. So at this time, you have several people, 2 or 3 here, who not really in fellowship. They have severed connections, but they're not too close to their own church anymore. For one reason or the other, they get together in somebody's home and they're breaking bread. And they have another 2 or 3 or 4 somewhere else. And you have a number of these little groups that share the same opinion, breaking bread privately. Now, it is the fusion of 2 or 3 of such groups which led to the beginning of the Plymouth Brethren as a distinct movement. Right? So that is somewhere in 1829, late 1829, when all these various 2 or 3 gathering here, 2 or 3 gatherings somewhere else, they all came together and made one group and began to meet. And the Plymouth Brethren had its beginning. It is apparent that they had at that time no intention to create a new denomination. But however, it happens eventually, right? You say you're not they are against denominationalism, as they call it. However, the group started to grow, and a number of ordinary people of humble origin, began to join the group. We noticed that the original ones were mostly well-educated people, many of them trained as ministers and ordained, right? But now they're getting more people, not necessarily of that high standard of education or wealth, but and that's another thing we noticed about the original people. Some of them were quite well off, right? But ordinary people began to join them, and so the group started to get larger. Right? And that is how it usually goes. Now, Cronin, you heard about before, and a man named John Parnell, another one named Stokes, I don't have his full name, and several ladies formed the committed nucleus of the new congregation. The meeting almost permanently now. And there were continual additions of evangelical Christians to the meeting. Mostly, as Cronin describes them, those who were coming in attracted to the simplicity of this group, right? And the fact that they're not dependent on any ordained minister, and eventually they didn't believe that anybody should be an ordained minister, right? They don't call anybody pastor. It became one of their doctrines that is not part of New Testament Christianity. And Cronin describes them as evangelical malcontents, right? People disgusted and frustrated by wherever they were, established church or in some evangelical group that had lost its zeal, or wherever they were coming into this new group. So he called them evangelical malcontents, desiring a wider communion fellowship than that offered by the churches that they were previously attending. Right? And apparently the early brethren had no clearly defined aims. Aims were later worked out by people who inquiring into the movement. but it seems that they themselves had no worked out aims, anything set down on paper or program, but simply found themselves drawn together by common sentiments. Right? They long for the same thing, they feel the same way, right? They believe when they read the scriptures, they see eye to eye on certain things, and so they enjoy each other's fellowship. Now, the unplanned free worship was for a long time not practiced in the early group in Dublin. Apparently, there was prayer, singing, teaching, reading of the scriptures, the usual thing we would expect in a meeting of that type, Christian meeting for worship. Now, again, we are left to put certain things together without being told. But it is possible by looking at those people who were flowing into the movement. It is possible that this unplanned service, the practice that has continued among them, where the services are unplanned, was the result of the joining the group of several hundred disaffected Quakers. Right? And at least one of the early founder members, Newton, B.W. Newton, right? What is Newton's name? Find his Benjamin Wills Newton, right? At least he had a Quaker background. He was an ex-Quaker, right? At least one, but apparently a number of people left the Quaker church and flowed into the group. So it is likely that they brought their Quaker influence. Some people refer to brethren churches as Quakers. They're not really Quakers because there were some things that the Quakers allowed that they don't to this day, right? At least, I don't know, maybe some of them have put it aside by now. But the Quakers always allowed women equal participation. If you remember when we did the beginning of the Quaker Church in the 17th century, Quakers allowed women to stand up and speak in the presence of men on both sexes, right, in their meetings. Brethren do not. Members of any brethren, any type of brethren, still do not, as far as I know. Right? So the unplanned nature of the Sunday breaking of bread service apparently, it we say, may have come from the influx of ex-Quakers, but somehow or other, the silencing of women, sorry, not the silencing, the allowing of women to speak up in the meetings, somehow or other, the Quakers did not succeed in bringing that across, because that is one of the things that we know about the Brethren Church, that they feel very strongly that the Lord is terribly offended at women speaking up in presence of men. Right? So they're not actually, they have not descended from the Quakers, but there is some kind of Quaker influence in the early days. Right? So looking at John, looking at Anthony Norris Groves, gives us an idea of the beginning in Ireland, in Dublin. Now, another person whose life can give us some insight is John Nelson Darby himself. His lifespan was 1800 to 1882. Groves, a slightly older man, 1795 to 1853. Right? Darby was born in 1800 and lived to be 1882. Right? Now, he's not Irish. He's not, he was of Irish parents, but he was actually born in London to a prominent Anglo-Irish family. They were for some time in London when he was born, but he's really of Irish parents, but Anglican Church, Irish family. He attended London's Westminster School until his parents moved back to an ancestral castle in Ireland. So already we see who we're dealing with, somebody with family with some kind of upper class connections, nobility, lesser nobility or what. They got an ancestral castle to move back to in Ireland. He graduated from Dublin's Trinity College as a classical gold medalist, right? Very well educated, and continued his studies in law, as we saw when he met with Bellett and Groves. He was admitted to the Irish Chancery Bar in 1882. So he was actually a lawyer, right? Called to the bar. But his law career was to be short-lived. About somewhere around 1826, he decided that he wanted to go into the priesthood. He gave up the law to become a priest, and he took a position as a curate, right, in the established Church of England in Ireland. So he's an Anglican priest. Now, what brings some little bit of confusion here? Not really confusion, because he says, why am I doing this? Why are you doing this? He says, because he wanted to help poor Irish Catholics, right? His desire to work among poor Irish Catholics. And he said, I owe myself entirely to God. I long for complete devotedness to the work of God. Now, he was quite good as a pastor. He became a successful pastor, very hardworking, right? Absorbed in his ministry to poor people, ordinary people. Would not come home before midnight most time. But still, as he read his Bible, he became frustrated with the condition of the established church. He said his assessment of the formalized Anglican Church in Ireland, that it was lifeless beyond repair. Right? Lifeless beyond repair. And he also wrote the famous statement that the church is in ruins. So this was one of the attitudes and outlooks that would become part of the brethren outlook. That look, it's no point trying to resurrect that. It's no point trying to continue belonging to that. Just come out of it and give yourself totally to God, right? And it's one of the things that people accuse them of, even into modern times. They don't see any sense in the church, the established church. It's beyond redemption. Lifeless beyond repair. Now, after only 2 years, Darby resigned from the priesthood. And then is when he joined this group of similarly disillusioned Christians who were already meeting and calling themselves simply brethren. Right? So this group was started somewhere in the 1828, 29. We see it meeting at least by 1829, it's meeting. And then Darby joins the group, right? So he wasn't there in the very beginning, but he joins the group, right? What were some of the things the group in those early days stood for? The group was committed.
Sam? So
Yes.
About what year did he join the group?
Let me see, somewhere about 1826, 28. It looks like around, well, if he was ordained in 1826 and he spent only 2 years and then resigned, he would have started going to that group somewhere, either late 1828 or early 29. Right? Remember, the group is taking shape. It's not, in those days, it's still coming together. So it looks to me, I don't know what time elapsed between the time that he left the priesthood. It would be somewhere around 1828. He spent only 2 years. I don't know if he joined the group. He started going to them immediately or a few months elapsed. But I would put it somewhere at least between 1828 and 29.
Thank you.
That there again, I have to speculate too, right? These people got a surprising amount of detail for a situation where people hiding information from them, and some of it just does not exist. You know? But this man did a whole lot of work, right? More than one person in narrowing these things down. So I would say somewhere between 1828 and 29. It can't be absolutely certain.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, the group was committed to operate by strict biblical methods. There was no, there were to be no professional minister. By the time they got settled as a group, they had decided that they don't believe in anybody being a professional minister. Right? The ministry is strictly in the hands of gifted laymen, people who show themselves as capable, right, and as zealous and, Christ-centered. They emerge, but nobody is ordained. That became a permanent thing. We don't call nobody minister. We don't call anybody pastor. We don't ordain anybody. They rejected denominationalism. That one there, I don't feel competent to go into that, right? They believed the Holy Spirit would lead in their worship. Therefore, their plans for their Sunday services were few. They focused their meeting on simple communion services served by a different individual each week. Now, another hazy date which we can't really, a date which is even more hazy, at least to me at this point, is when the group migrated to Plymouth, right? Somewhere in the mid-1830s. I can't get further than that. the group moved out from Ireland and migrated to Plymouth, England, sometime in its early days, and quickly became known as the Plymouth Brethren. That's where they got their ongoing name from, the name that they would be called by for a long time. It has to be somewhere in the mid-1830s, but perhaps a date is more closely available, but I don't have it at this time. But somewhere by the mid-1830s, they appear in Plymouth, England, and they're being called the Plymouth Brethren. Now, Darby is now part of the group. Although Darby was now no more a leader than anybody else by virtue of what the group believes, by virtue of his abilities, he quickly rose to prominence. Right? His 1828 pamphlet called The Nature and Unity of the Church of Christ, in which he described the group's beliefs and practices, quickly spread throughout, throughout the West, Western England, Western Europe. However, not sure what they mean by the West, because Darby himself began to travel. He becomes prominent. He is a gifted person, he's a highly educated person, and his personality apparently was a take charge sort of individual. So although nobody's being ordained, he rises to the top. Darby traveled to churches in Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, condemning denominationalism and calling believers to his new ecclesiology. Now, we already begin to read between the lines here and see that Darby seems to be establishing himself, not officially, but why does it have to be his new ecclesiology? Right? But that's how it is. Believers came to the group especially because of interest in the preaching about the end of the world. This end of the world and Jesus coming back very, very, very soon, by next week, by next year, whatever it is. That it was very attractive to people on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, the group also believed in what they call premillennialism. Premillennialism. Now, what is that? Premillennialism is the belief that this world will get worse until Christ returns to set up a visible 1,000-year reign of peace. Right? But Darby developed a new side to this premillennialism, which became known as dispensationalism. And apparently at the beginning, this was a prominent doctrine among them, which we don't hear too much about now. But for a time that was very prominent. Dispensationalism. Now, the belief that the history of it divides the history of the world into eras or dispensations. Now, most members agreed with Darby that there were 7 dispensations, and Darby gives them names. Here how he arrived at the 7. Here are the 7 that he arrived at. Paradise, that's Adam and Eve. Noah, Abraham, Israel, Gentiles, the Spirit, the Holy Spirit that is, and the millennium. Those were the 7 that he came up with. Now, there was nothing really new about dividing history into eras, but what was new about Darby's version was, number one, the strict literalism of his biblical interpretation, and two, the absolute separation of Israel and the church into 2 distinct peoples of God. 3, the separation of the rapture, which is the catching away of the church, secret, quiet catching away of the church from Christ's actual second coming. Now he explains at the rapture, Christ will come for his saints, while at his second coming, he will come with his saints. Now I have heard that. I've heard that. Some groups, some people specifically get into it and they lay that out. Now, Darby, with his kind of personality, ended up creating a split among the Plymouth Brethren. Now, Darby proved to be a harsh, judgmental person, and a particular incident caused a split among the Plymouth Brethren. Now, there are already in England, Plymouth, England, somewhere in the 30s still. How it happened? Some member of the group differed from him on issues of prophecy and church order. Darby forthwith excommunicated the man. Even after the man had admitted his error, and he demanded a public refutation for anyone to be readmitted to the Lord's table. So anything goes wrong, even if you disagree with him and he feels you're wrong, he dismisses you from the Lord's table. You can't break bread, right? And he does it even after the man says, okay, I admit that I made a mistake there. You must go publicly. It must be done in public before you could come back to break bread. Now, that's not very kind of him. But I remember that Calvin had the same kind of behavior. He used to press a punishment to its extreme. Now, the whole church, a branch in the Bethesda group, refused to comply with his demand. All right, they thought he was just being unreasonable and that he ain't got no right to treat the man or treat anybody else and demand public statement and things like that. So Darby refused. The entire group. Oh, he come to be in charge. Somebody in charge, and is he? Nobody is supposed to be actually in charge. They're supposed to be working, moving together, but Darby somehow or other is in charge. He refused to receive all of its members. The whole Bethesda church get excommunicated. They can't break bread. Anyhow, they're not accepting that. And so there was a split. And those who went with Darby separated from the rest of the Plymouth Brethren. And eventually, Darby and his followers created a tightly knit group of churches known as exclusive brethren or Darbyites. This is how you get a difference between exclusive and open. So it is to Darby's account that we have Darby to thank for the presence of 2 distinct types of brethren, exclusive, right? Now the others maintain the more congregational approach, all right? Apparently the exclusives all the exclusive churches have to hold one head. If you put out somebody from one exclusive church, that person will be refused from all the others. Yes. However, those who did not follow Darby, they maintained a more congregational approach to church government, where the local church has a lot of ability to autonomy to decide what happens within their little meeting, right? Congregational approach to church government with less stringent membership standards. And they became known as open brethren. So that happened somewhere in the 1840s, between 1848, 45 and 48. Again, dates are hazy, right? Somewhere between 1845 and 48, that split took place. Now, to tell you the kind of person Darby was, later in the century, when Dwight Moody from the USA, American evangelist, made efforts to befriend him, Darby condemned and refused him because they disagreed on quote unquote freedom of will. That I deduce is the Calvinist and the Arminian view. How much will a person, how much it rests with a person's will whether he will be saved, or is it entirely God, up to God? Is it all planned and you either lost or you're saved by the time you get on the earth? Calvinist, Arminianist, right? So they had the differences. Moody most likely was more Arminian in his views, and he condemned and refused to have any fellowship with him, right? The man was seeking to befriend him, and he just wasn't open to it at all because they differ in opinion. Right? That's the type of person he apparently was. In spite of his harsh and divisive behavior, Darby's views gained a larger and larger following. It is assessed that today his dispensational millennialism is still the view of many modern fundamentalists and conservative evangelicals. So although people don't actually come at you too much with things like that, there are still groups that if you get down to discussing with them, that's their view. Right? So that was Darby's looking at the lives of those two. We get a good idea of how the Plymouth Brethren came into existence. But I want to push it slightly further, right? More development, yes. The split is somewhere between 1945 and 48. The Open Brethren asserted that each assembly is responsible to Christ.
Excuse me, 1845, 1848.
Pardon?
I think it's 1845.
Yes, 1845.
I think it said 19.
Sorry.
That got me thinking about the World War.
That's post-World War.
Yes.
Sorry about that. That can't be. It can't be 19. Yes.
Just some questions before you go.
Yeah.
So Darby, after the split, he was more associated with the exclusive brethren. Is that right?
Exclusive, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely exclusive. All right.
And just confirm that Darby was more Calvinist.
Calvinist, definitely. Yes.
Okay. All
very intolerant. So those exclusives still maintain that kind of stand. Now the open brethren, they believe that each congregation, each assembly they call themselves, right? Which even today they would ask the people, which assembly are you from? They don't use the word congregation too much. They talk about assembly. They believe that each assembly had a responsibility to Christ and had the right to conduct its own affairs. They usually welcome all true believers to the Lord's table. I don't know how true that is in every single case. And they practice believers' baptism. You know that. It might differ from one assembly to the other, one area to the other, but they're said to be willing to welcome all true believers.
Yes,
Once they're satisfied that you're a true believer.
yes,
They
you may need a
practice
letter of
believers'
commendation. Zan? Yes,
Pardon?
they welcome all believers, but if you're coming from
Say that,
if you're coming from another assembly, like in another country, then you need to come with a letter of commendation.
yeah, because they don't have any way of knowing you at all.
Right. So you have to come with a letter of commendation.
I've heard of that, right? And obviously they practice believers' baptism. Now, the exclusives who follow Darby, they asserted that separation from evil, quote unquote, separation from evil was the only true basis of unity of believers. Now, what is separation from evil? That all assemblies should act together, but so they don't leave it to each assembly. You must act together. If a person was put out of one assembly, then all other assemblies must close their doors to that person. Any assembly accepting such a person was deemed to have become, quote, infected with spiritual evil, end of quote. And they practice, again, quotation, household baptism, including infants. Household baptism of infants. Now you can't, they baptize a whole house, a whole family. You can't immerse an infant, right? So I don't know if they immerse the adults and settle for sprinkling water on the babies. That could be seen. We got some idea that entire families were baptized in the New Testament, but we don't know whether babies, what they did with babies. They don't say how old the people were. They could have all been adults, right? But anyhow, they baptized the whole family and made the entire family members of their assembly, right? And if anybody falls foul of in one assembly, can't go to any of their exclusive churches. Is locked out. Can't go, not welcome, and certainly can't break bread. If the assembly admits him, they are infecting themselves with spiritual evil. Right? Now, eventually, Wills Newton was rejected by both sides. He fell out with them altogether. And apparently, at the end of his life, was bitter against all of them. The two sides had animosity and carried on a pamphlet war for the rest of the 19th century. Now they're burning up their energy. They write tracts against each other. You put out a tract, what you believe, I put out a tract to say that you're wrong. And they carried on an animosity for the rest of the 19th century, expressing it in pamphlet war. At first, most people tended to prefer the exclusives, but with time, many of them changed sides. can't put up with the exclusive anymore, right? Now, during this era, the Brethren group became strong on missionary movements, second perhaps only to the Moravians in the 19th century. And they are found today in at least 100 countries worldwide, sometimes in larger numbers than actually exist in Britain. Now, during the 1870s, I'm just bringing the whole brethren scenario to a close. During the 1870s, the Open Brethren founded the agency Echoes of Service. It's a missionary assistance group. They didn't send out missionaries because that was regarded as the responsibility of the local assembly, but they provided services like funds, information, advice, general assistance, Echoes of Service. That's a group, an agency, a missionary agency started by the Open Brethren. Now, more division. In 1890s, the Open Brethren saw another small split with the formation of the Church of God, sometimes known as, or used to be known as Needed Truth Brethren, after a magazine that they put out, something named Needed Truth. Anyhow, the Church of God came out of the Open Brethren. Now, they reject the autonomy of the local assemblies, employing a Presbyterian style inter-church relationship. They have something like a presbytery, a group that sends representatives and they make decisions. Right? So the Church of God came out of the Open Brethren. Now, Exclusive Brethren saw a number of splits late in the century from 1881. Now, so you have a number of people with the Brethren assemblies with the exclusive stamp, right? But that are not actually related to each other. The largest split in the Exclusive Brethren group was the coming into existence of the Taylor Brethren, or the Taylorites. Now, who Taylor is, I have not gone into who Taylor was, but that is a withdrawn community, right? Which people sometimes misleadingly call exclusive. They are not the regular Exclusive Brethren. They have one man as their global leader. I didn't even know that, but that's what they say. A contemporary equivalent of St. Paul the Apostle, deemed to have divine guidance which all members must follow. Right? Other exclusive groups have remained closer to the Calvinist evangelicalism. Now, and they caution that we should not mix up the Taylor or the Taylorite Brethren with the general exclusives, right? Now, this Taylorite group, where do I have that? Oh, now the Taylorite group, right, is hyper Calvinist, rigidly Puritan, highly centralized in organization. They're supposed to have some one person globally running the show. It rejects all links and fellowship and contact with the outside world, even with other evangelical Christians. Rigid group endogamy. You have any marriage taking place, right? If you're unmarried and you are going to get married, you have to get married to one of their group. right? Or you leave the group. Where only one partner of a marriage is a member, they strongly advocate permanent separation. Now, that is the group that don't have anything to do with other people. They reject newspapers, radio, television, whatever. And they refuse to eat a meal in the company of outsiders. They have minimal social contact with non-members, only what is absolutely necessary for them to continue living, all because of the imminent personal return of Christ. But I suspect also because they feel that all outside their group are evil, and that communication with anybody else, not even not evangelicals, would serve to pollute them, or they're partaking of somehow your evil, and they're going to be contaminated with your spiritual evil. These are the people who don't eat anything from prepared by anybody who is not a member of the group. Nothing whatever, right? You cannot, a member of the family cannot leave the Taylorite movement except they move out to the house.
This is Freddie. Yes, good afternoon. This is Freddie Flats.
I think this is the group that, hello?
Yes.
Yeah, this is the group that I think that people call closed brethren. I know they existed up to the 80s in Barbados, right? Where if one member leaves the church, the member has to move out from the family, or else the whole family has to leave the church, right? Apparently there were groups in Guyana at one point. I was told by my mother that the building, the property that now on which Merriman's Funeral Parlor stands, that there was a closed brethren church. So she told me.
A white building.
Huh?
A white building.
A white building? I don't know. That's before my conscious memory. And that's what how she described them. Those were closed brethren people. I do not know if we have any such left in Guyana. But that particular one closed down, and Merriman bought it and made a funeral parlor, right? But it the building, somehow or other, the property maintained the image of a chapel, right? Because it was a church on that premises there, but you couldn't eat with any member of the family. You couldn't entertain any member of the family or a relative who's not a close brethren. And I have heard from my friend, unfortunately now deceased, who grew up as one, that while going from Barbados to the United States, they have direct arrangements that they're going specially to a close brethren family in the States. And while on the plane, they have to suffer hunger. They can receive nothing, right, from the airline to eat. It's unclean, right? It's evil, right? They can't receive anything. They have to stay hungry for whatever number of hours they're in transit, because they can only receive meals from fellow close brethren, and they could only eat in the presence of fellow close brethren. The only contact is that which they absolutely must have to keep alive. They have to send their children to school, and so she went to an Anglican school, right? You have to go buy your stuff somewhere, they go buy. But anything that they could avoid doing, they don't talk to other people much, except they have to, right? And now, I don't know if they call themselves Taylorite, but their behavior is the description here of the Taylorites. Now, the only point of agreement they have with other brethren groups is that the fervent belief of the advent of Christ very soon, right? That Christ is coming soon. All the groups believe that. And there is also a separate, an absence of a separate ministerial order. You don't ordain anybody. There is no pastor, right? All are brethren. They have a charismatic or free worship after the Quaker style. Only difference from the Quakers is that the Quakers used to allow women to speak, whereas no brethren assembly, any brethren assembly, only male audible participation in the breaking of bread service. In those things, they are similar. But as would be expected, there are many other groups of Plymouth Brethren, somewhere between the Open Brethren and the Taylorite extreme. The largest known in Britain, called by the name Low Kelly Brethren. They are very much like the Taylorites, right? But they are much more tolerant and much broader. They communicate with people a lot more, right? But in some ways they behave like the Taylorites. So when you meet a group, I don't know exactly where they came from and what is their origin. But some brethren groups are very, 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 we would call them exclusive. But this Taylorite group here is definitely what we know, or we would call close brethren. So you will meet with some groups that are very strict, but they're not really Taylorite, but each group is somewhere in between. But the Open Brethren in recent years has become known as the Christian Brethren. And that's the brethren to which we are accustomed in Guyana. That's Open Brethren, right? Whether they were open and exclusive in Guyana, I am not competent to say which is which. I know that they had two different sources of brethren groups right here in Georgetown, and it still exists. They don't call themselves by the names now. There was the Collier Brethren when the older generation, the old people who are now gone, when they were young. Collier Brethren and the Reimer Brethren in Georgetown. Somebody, missionary named Collier, came with one, and so I don't know which is which. One became the East Street Brethren Third, which obviously is a little more conservative than what became the Bethel Gospel Hall, Camp Street. Anyhow, so whether a group is very strict or whether they are more moderate, probably depends on who they came from. But in Georgetown, somebody named Reimer came and established one, and somebody named Collier came and established another. Those were missionary names. Now, I don't know which is which, but both had Sunday schools. And at 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, you were either, regardless of where you belong, most children went to a Brethren Sunday school, either Reimer, Collier. But I cannot label the two groups because I have not looked into where they individually came from. But the East Street people have a tendency to be more conservative, but I don't think they're closed. they don't fit the description of Taylorite brethren or the close brethren. Anyhow, that in a nutshell is how the Brethren Church began. Now, the brethren have contributed significantly to the body of Christ around the world, in Guyana no less, with their emphasis on study of the scriptures, taking the scriptures seriously and studying the scriptures. A lot of the doctrines that we hear of in the beginning, I don't know if they just sidestep them. They don't really emphasize them in their dealings with people, like strict Calvinism. They are described as moderately Calvinist. That is how they describe today the open brethren, or what is now the Christian brethren. That's the name they're now known by across Britain and British-oriented places like Guyana. They're known as the Christian brethren, right? So that is the beginning of the Brethren Church, right? Now, in the over in the 20th century, they took the forefront in evangelism. Okay? Evangelistically, always very active, solidly taught, always tending to be growing, with a lay leadership, often well attuned to the issues of the day.
Excuse me, Anne.
Yes, time to.
About how much more time would you need?
I plan to close now because I don't think I could go further.
Okay.
Because it's already, what is it saying? It's already 5:30.
Yes.
5, right?
Yes.
I don't think I should go further. Whatever else I had, I have to leave. Got to be left back.
All right.
I couldn't
sorry
make
to cut
it
you
to
up. You want to round off before
Journal.
we stop, or that's it?
Basically, that's it. Only to say that the coming into existence of the Brethren Church was part of the early 19th century British people desiring to have a fellowship that is Bible close established church. As a matter of fact, what part of what they're criticized for in modern times, people get the impression that they want to tell them that only the Brethren Church is acceptable to God. I know that that is not true, right? But people get that impression that, they believe they're the only true believers. That's not true, right? But this disillusionment, writing off the established church, and anybody that they witness to or they lead them to Christ, they expect that person would do away with that old connection and join themselves to the Brethren Church. But I don't see that as much different from any other evangelical group. But anyhow, they used to be, and probably they used to be highly criticized, right? Highly criticized, but the number of people owe their foundation to that body of believers. Number of people owe their foundation as believers, grounding in the Word of God, to the Brethren Church. They're also influential in the founding of the London Bible College, now the London School of Theology. Okay. Very active in evangelism into the 20th century. But that is another group that became very active in England, in Britain, in the coming up in the early 19th century and continuing on into present time. Right? Now that is not a close here because of time, but that's not the entire picture. You have other great preachers at that time, Charles Spurgeon, and in 1859, there's another spiritual explosion, but I leave that. Unfortunately, I have to leave that for another time. All right. And here I would like to close.
Sister Ann, thank you for your comprehensive dealing with the subject. The most comprehensive study I've heard of the Christian Brethren Church, and it's the first time I know about the open brethren and the closed brethren. I don't know how many people really know the difference. I don't know how many people really know the difference between in Guyana, right? And I'm glad that you also stated that the Camp Street Brethren is one of the open brethren, because you have people like myself and Eleanor, Aubrey and Junan, Sister Pam, quite a few of us coming down from that.
Come out from that
denomination. And it is important to know where you come from. It's also interesting to know the difference between the open and the exclusive brethren. For those who do not know, we have an exclusive brethren church at East and Quamina streets, right?
I really don't know. I don't want to. I have not studied their origin, right? So the origin of the two different sets of people. So I don't know. I don't label them. I don't know.
No, well,
they're definitely more conservative. They're definitely more conservative, but I don't know whether one came from the exclusive, possibly. But I have not looked into it, so I don't want to,
well, I'm
say
saying
what I don't know about.
Well, I know that that's the one at East and Quamino, that's an exclusive Brethren church. And there are.
It is exclusive?
Yes, you also have on the Esquivel Coast.
Okay.
They have other parts of Guyana. I don't know much about them.
But very moderate, exclusive.
Well, I don't know.
Well, in modern times, there has been a lot of the system has given in several directions, so that even what we would the Camp Street Bethel Gospel Hall that we consider Christian brethren, open brethren. There was a time in the 20th century when they were very, very, very strict about certain things. Like somewhere in the 1940s, a leading member of the church could still get read out. Why? For playing a harmonium, carrying a harmonium to play in a youth service. dismiss him from the church. And he went and established Grace Gospel in Princess Street. Right? That was Brother Peter King, father of Carmen Jarvis, late head teacher of Bishop's High School. That made an indelible impression on her growing up. She and her brothers and sisters, and her sister. He's vibrant, youth meeting, and he carries a harmonium and play not in the breaking of bread, but in the youth meeting, and they put him out of the church. So, they are open brethren, but at the same time, how open. But today, there is a lot of opening, a lot of things that, when I was a teenager, I accepted from them, right? You know that that's how they are, and you accept it. The young people don't know anything about that now. A lot of things. When I tell them, they say, no, we don't. I hear about it, but that's not the case now. They born the other day and they hear about those things. When you couldn't enter a woman couldn't enter the meeting room without having something completely covering her head. Even in the youth service where people who don't belong to the church would visit. You have to put on something in your head. If you're uncommitted, they give you. Right? And as for ladies wearing garments that have not only armholes, not only with armholes, but that's another story. Done with that a long time. But anything that has two legs, no. Not even on an outing. No. Well, I noticed it since the 80s. I see certain people's children passing by with jeans. I say, what?